give you a brief overview of what our agenda will be for today. First of all, I want to go over the basics of grant information, and we'll start from the beginning, assuming that you may know very little about grants. And if you do know some about grants and need some extra information, hopefully that material will be contained today and will still be useful to you. We'll identify how to find grants, where you can locate them, specific to the type of agency or group or department that you might be. And then we're going to look at the application process that's involved with grants. They generally follow a pretty standard form, and they usually have the same types of materials included in them. And then we'll look at some of the best practices and helpful tips for applying for grants if you're new to the process, or even if you've done it already but it's been a while. And then lastly, we're actually going to go through an applied step-by-step example of the application process, so you can see at least briefly some of the example materials for a grant that you could apply for that should parallel any of the other grants that might be out there, depending on the type of agency you work with or for, or the type of department that you're in. And then finally, we'll have time at the end for questions and any other interests and concerns. Briefly about me, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cincinnati in the Department of Criminal Justice. And as mentioned, I've had 5 to 6 years or so of grant experience, either applying for them or managing them myself or with other faculty at the university. 2 of those years have been spent working with BlueStar as a grant assistance person, and we provide that assistance to anyone who works with any of the people that BlueStar distributes to. So there's been multiple opportunities to get to go through this and try to help educate people, and I hope that the things that we cover today prove to be as useful as the things we've done in the past. So getting started into the grant basics. First of all, if you don't know what they are programs that generally come through federal and state departments or federal and state agencies, and they allocate funding for various initiatives. So most of the time they're used in 2 particular ways. The most common way, as far as the money that's allocated through the federal government, is through research and evaluation. And this is where people generate evidence-based practices. This is often an academic endeavor, and most of the time the people who run these grants are academic faculty, various universities. The second is what's more important for us today, and that is agency assistance. So supporting limited budgets is an incredibly important part of grants today, as it has been for several years. It probably will continue to be important because so many agencies and departments are dealing with very restricted funding issues and limitations as far as their budgets go. There are 2 essentially distinct types of grants. The first is an allocated or formula grant, and these are often state agency led, and they'll disperse that down to local agencies. So it could be the State Department of Education provides money to the local education districts. They can use that money for initiatives they have within their own schools. It could be a State Department of Public Safety that then gives that money to the local law enforcement and public safety agencies. And then secondly, there are the competitive grants. And these are the more common grants in terms of what we're talking about today and what would be possible options for you. And in this context, both state and local agencies or departments submit directly to a federal program to compete for various funds. And the name itself, competitive, implies that you will have to generate one of the better grant proposals or applications to be able to be picked. And if you have a proposal that seems to compete well and has high appeal for the reviewers, you have a good shot of possibly getting that funding. With regard to finding opportunities, so we're going to search for where these grants even exist and how to find them and learn to use them. The most important website that I can probably provide to you today is this grants.gov. That's the central housing website for any grant that could go through the federal government for any federal government agency. So anything that you would want that might be of interest in terms of public safety and law enforcement or fire and EMS, you'll find on grants.gov. Those are often overseen by the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security's Federal Emergency Management Agency. So FEMA and the Homeland Security people handle some of those, and the Justice Department handles many of the other ones. And lastly, we have the Disaster Relief and Preparedness, which is related to Homeland Security and federal emergency aid and those things. Finally, there are education opportunities as well for grant opportunities within universities, high schools, primary schools. Those are overseen oftentimes by the Department of Education. But I should mention that they are also overseen in many ways by the Department of Homeland Security as it pertains to school safety and security. I'll also mention about the education section that it's not a grant program, but there is a purchasing program that operates similarly to a grant that many people maybe are familiar with, called the E-rate program, E-R-A-T-E. And that's another opportunity outside of the grants that could be something that would be a viable option for you. Now, to get into the technical aspects and details of the application process, we'll start at the beginning. One of the most important things that you can do is carefully read a grant solicitation that you would find on grants.gov or the request for proposals. In that, you'll find all the important information as it pertains to applying to a grant. And that'll include what should be included in the actual materials you generate. So the proposal itself, the written narrative, what do they want you to cover, how do they want you to explain it, even the structure in terms of outline and form will be included in the grant solicitation. Also important is the eligibility of who can apply to which grants. So you'll want to know if you yourself need to submit the materials to the grant program, or if you're a local agency, does the state agency submit on your behalf? And related to that, you'll also want to be able to know from the grant solicitation if what you're proposing in terms of your project or initiative is allowable under that grant program. So if, for example, you're interested in obtaining computers and some specialized software for something that you're going to do within a school or within a public safety agency, you'll want to make sure in the grant solicitation that it's noted that you can purchase and obtain computers and related software and equipment for that grant. And if it's not allowable, you'll want to look for other grant options that do allow that. So oftentimes these grant programs are targeted to specific groups and agencies in terms of who they serve and what they do. You'll be able to determine that from the grant solicitation. And one of the most important aspects of the grant solicitation is the deadline for submission. Oftentimes, this is going to be one of the first things you'll see in a grant solicitation, but it's one of the most important so that you don't lose your opportunity to apply to a grant simply because you didn't know when the deadline was to submit the materials. As far as housekeeping issues go with grant solicitations, when you actually go to apply, you'll need to obtain this DUNS number that I have referenced here in the slides, and you'll also need to complete the contractor registration. These two things serve as the identification for your specific agency or department within the grant application system. When you apply to it through websites, they'll often need to track you and know who you are or what you submitted. This is their way of doing so. Moreover, if a state agency is going to submit the grant application or grant proposal on your behalf, they already will have these identification numbers. And if they don't, it'll be their responsibility to obtain them prior to submitting your grant application. One of the more important things here is that you need to spend the time putting your materials together, but also make sure that you put enough time into getting these IDs in place. As I mentioned here, if there's not that much traffic on their websites and they don't have too many applications, it could take only a couple days to get this information and back to you, but it can take up to a month just to get your identification in order with the grant program. As far as materials go, you'll have to prepare and generate application materials. This is what we're going to look at the end of the presentation as far as our applied example. You'll submit the materials before the deadline. As mentioned and will continue to be mentioned, the earlier the better. This way you can try to avoid any of the technical issues when you try to submit, but if you do run into technical issues, if you're early, you can get them taken care of and not lose your opportunity to apply. And it's also a good chance for you to go into some of the websites that you'll submit this to through either grants.gov or the specific agency you're looking to submit an application to know what type of files they require you to put them in, whether that be a PDF file or our Word documents sufficient, and then also the uploading process to make sure that you know exactly how it should be uploaded and how you can be successful in making sure it gets to the right people. Once you submit that grant application, you'll be provided with a tracking number so you can keep track during the review process of what the status is of the grant application and when the anticipated date of decisions will come. As far as who reviews the grant applications, this is oftentimes both government personnel within the specific agency or department that you're submitting to, and also they'll use outside experts. So it may be some type of grant initiative that you're applying to that people within the government may not have the expertise to comment on. They'll find academics or other professionals outside of the government to review that material as far as the distinctness of it and the viability of the initiative as it's outlined in your proposal. So after the proposals are reviewed, they'll send out funding notifications. This is often just the yes-no decision of you did get the funding or you didn't. And as I mentioned here, there's usually up to 6 months that they'll expect to have that review turned around. In rare circumstances, it can take longer than 6 months, but usually a good time frame to consider when you might hear something back about your proposal is 3 to 6 months. And then if you are funded, and you're fortunate enough to be funded, the initial monies that you'll be using to purchase whatever it is that you were applying for will be dispersed to you or whoever will oversee that money, and you'll have the opportunity to begin your grant program. For some very general tips and best practices, first and foremost, get started early. The deadlines are very firm, and often these agencies put the cutoff at 11:59 p.m. on the end of day that they're required to be submitted, and they will not provide any other circumstances under which you can submit late. Typically, the application period is 30 to 60 days, so you might have a month to 2 months to work on these things, and that's why getting started early is an important part of the process. Sometimes you'll see them on the lower end of about 30 days, but this is really the time that they'll put out the proposal requests. You'll have the time to generate the materials and then get them to the appropriate agencies by the deadline. And getting started early obviously decreases the chance that you'll miss the deadline to submit the materials. And as well, utilize the resources that are available to you, whether they be online. A lot of these agencies, and you'll find them through grants.gov, provide tutorials and webinars and other important guidance in terms of how to write things, what an example specific to the grant program you're looking for is and what it would look like. And then also you have the ability through using these resources to contact a grant office if you have any questions. So if there's something in the solicitation that doesn't make a lot of sense to you, or the wording is funny, or you have a concern something couldn't be funded under the guidelines they have, feel free to call those people. I personally called them several times with my own work or the work of others, and they're always very helpful, and they want to be that type of resource to the people applying to their grant programs. And finally, you can utilize the grant assistance that I can provide through BlueStar with our relationship with Rayco Industries. So these are all important things that you could use to increase your chances of applying to and successfully obtaining funding from a grant program. All right, let's move into the application example. And this is an old grant that used to exist that doesn't anymore, but it provides a good opportunity for anyone from various agencies, whether it be public safety or schools using the Safe Schools initiatives. Education would be able to apply for these types of things as well as public safety. But the basic scenario here is we're going to apply to this grant because we want to use ID badges within the school for personnel and then later probably students. So we're going to use these for a specific reason, and we'll get into that in a moment. But first and foremost, we've already gotten our registration information out of the way. We have our ID notification in the system so they know who we are and what we plan to do. And we've read the solicitation and know exactly what we're doing, and at least as best we can, and we're going to begin to prepare the materials to submit for the grant program. Usually you're going to have to provide an abstract. This is just a snapshot of what the entire program and initiative is going to do. They're usually 600 words or less. And what you're trying to do in this small snapshot is identify the problem and how you're going to fix that problem, so to speak. And then lastly, what you expect to see when the problem is fixed. So the sort of deliverable or measurable outcome from your efforts in this grant initiative. Most of the time, abstracts are used as a screening tool to be able to send your application amongst others to the right people to review them so that the most appropriate person can make decisions about the grant proposal that you've submitted against other people's grant proposals. And this provides you an example, a very short example of what this would look as far as a narrative. So we're going to identify that we want to implement ID scanners and cards. We're worried about trespassing and burglary, and so we expect that once we implement them, a significant decrease in trespassing and burglary will be expected. The bulk of your proposal is going to be contained in the program narrative. This will be the longest section, and oftentimes within a grant solicitation, this will have the most detail in terms of what should your proposal include. So we're going to elaborate on the full details of the project that you plan to carry out. And I have the typical headings listed here that you'll see in just about any grant, whether that be from a law enforcement agency or an education department, whether that be actually a primary or secondary school. Generally, you'll all follow the same pattern. So we have our purpose, goals, and objectives. So what is the problem, and how do we plan to solve that? Within the review of literature, you'll want to see if you can find studies on something related to what you've already done to show that it's already been successful. And if you have that ability, or if it's applicable, this is your way of saying, look, other people have already done it, we've had success, we want to do that as well, and this is how we plan to do it. With research, design, and methods, this is your opportunity to demonstrate how you're going to show that it did work successfully and how you'll measure those things. So you'll have a concrete plan to implement the solution, and then what way will you evaluate that? And lastly, you're going to provide a timeline and your organizational capabilities. This basically is a roadmap for when things will be carried out, the dates that you expect to be able to achieve certain things in terms of the start and finish of a grant program. So as an example here, a very short example of the literature review and the purpose of the study, you'll see that we have identified the school that we plan to implement our ID scanners, a citation to Harold and Schmidt that they found in the Colorado secondary system that crimes have seemed to increase a lot over the last 10 years, so we've got some previous literature to support our case. And then lastly, our expectations for using the ID scanners. We'll see a decrease in the burglary and trespassing, as well as increasing high school students and the staff's safety. Our design and methods is the technical details of how we'll measure this, and this may or may not be applicable to the grant program that you're interested in. I just want to make sure that it's included in the event that that's the case for you. So we'll use a pre- and post-test design. More or less, this is our design for a study, if we were going to be doing a study of the use of the ID scanners and how successful they were. So we'll have, the data before we implement them, and then we'll look at the data after we've implemented them to see if burglary and trespassing did indeed decrease. And we might even there at the end use some statistical tests to determine if that was a significant decrease along the grant program. You will have to provide budget information. Oftentimes it's going to be a budget and then a budget narrative, which will be the next slide. This is where you show how much money you need and what it'll be used for. Oftentimes this is going to be in the realm of equipment, software, and services. So we have just line item budget information within this slide. We'll explain that through the budget narrative. And so this is where we break down what those numbers actually mean, so they know exactly where every bit of the money is going to. So we've got the actual hardware, the mobile printers and things. We have how much the software is going to cost us. And then lastly, if we need to do any statistical testing, we'll purchase the statistical software with this grant money. And if there are no indirect costs, you'll note that in the budget narrative. That basically means that whoever pays the light bill has already gotten taken care of, so we don't need to use this grant money to pay the light bill for overhead costs and related issues. And finally, there's going to be a number of required forms for any number of grants. These are always identified in the request for proposals or the solicitation. So make sure that you know who's supposed to be signing them and when they're supposed to be signing them. This could be the city council, it could be the city manager, it could be your school district superintendent. Any number of the right administrative people will have to sign some of these forms. They're usually to cover legal issues and also conflicts of interest. But if you have concerns or questions about required forms, always contact the grant program and see if any one of them can explain to you, and they'll usually get you in the right direction and also help you make sure the right people are signing them so that you can submit them on time. That covers what we wanted to cover today, and I think we're going to open it up now for questions. Again, thanks for this opportunity. I hope that these things prove to be helpful for you.
Kevin, thank you very much for the presentation. We have a few questions already. If anyone else in the audience still has a question that they'd like to answer, just put it in the question section and go ahead and we'll get to those here. The first one, we have a couple questions about state-level grants. Are they different from what the federal government offers, and where is the best place to find state-level grants?
Usually with state-level grants, they'll often follow the exact same sort of form and purpose as the federal level, and they'll usually be housed within the same types of agencies. So if it's a public safety grant that someone is interested in, as opposed to looking for the Federal Department of Justice, they would usually go within their own state government. Let's say, for example, that it's California. They'll go into the California Department of Public Safety's website or the California government website. From there, they'll be able to identify what state-level grants exist. And as I mentioned, they're often the same as the ones at the federal level. It's just usually more appropriate for smaller agencies or smaller schools to be able to go for that money because there's going to be less competition than at the federal level. And as far as when finding them and utilizing them, there can be some state-level grants that do differ from federal levels. So I would always recommend examining both federal-level opportunities and the opportunities that could exist within your own state. So if the federal level does not provide an opportunity for some type of highway public safety grant or the acquisition of computers for a library or computer lab within a school, the state may provide a specific opportunity for that, and it would be a better suited grant option.
Okay, another question is there any free tutorials or help materials out there for writing a grant proposal?
There are many free tutorials and guidance websites out there, and I would highly recommend for any of you who attend this to use those when you move your department or your agency into the grant world. You can obviously pay for grant assistance and grant consulting and use some of the websites that may have that, but oftentimes you're going to get the same material and possibly even better suited for your capabilities by going to the specific grant program you're interested in applying to and seeing what they have to offer. The government does many webinars throughout the year when it's grant season, and when they do, they often bring in the experts within the industry to make sure the correct information is being portrayed to people. And all of this, of course, is free of cost, and there's no consulting or assistance fees associated with that. So I would highly recommend going to the grant program you're interested in and seeing if they offer any kind of webinar or free assistance and training in the process.
Looks like we have a couple questions and comments from those that are familiar with grants. One is, what is a match, and does every grant program have one?
Okay, a match is an amount that the agency or department applying for a grant program will have to provide themselves in terms of funding. So there may be in the solicitation or in the request for proposals a section that says there is a match for this grant program. It's a 10% match. So if your total project was going to be $100,000, the expectation is you'll be able to provide $10,000 of your own money, and they'll come up with the other $90,000 to get the full $100,000. Not every grant program requires a match, and that's why it's so important to read the request for proposals or solicitations. Some grants will require really large amounts of a match, up to 50%, but oftentimes if a match exists, it'll usually be between 10 and 20%. And this could be a cash contribution, so it might come out of your own local budgets, so it may come out of your Department of Education fund, but it provides you the opportunity to get a lot more money than you would have expected with the amount you already had in hand. Or it could be a contribution of services or cost sharing of some sort where you already have some of the computers, but you need more. The value of those computers that you're going to put in your computer lab can be a contribution to the match to be able to get your application through and not be denied because you couldn't come up with the original amount that you needed to contribute to the grant program.
One of our attendees is sharing their experience saying that with their city they have to get prior approval before they can apply for any grants, as the city tracks these to make sure the resources are available to implement the grant. Do you have any advice for those who maybe need to work within the system locally before they can even get to the grant application level?
Yes, actually, there's a couple of very important things when dealing with sort of what I would consider to be oversight process or oversight committees who would be involved, and that is to stay engaged with those people. Oftentimes when there needs to be a public comment on a grant before it can be proposed and then applied for, it'll have to go through the city council or city government, and they'll want to know where that money is going to go to. And at the same time, you're going to be competing. So if you're an agency that's within the Department of Education for your city government, and you have the Department of Public Safety who's also looking to apply for a grant, you need to stay competitive and stay appealing. So one of the more difficult things to do whenever I've provided this kind of assistance is to keep people engaged in who provides that oversight so that they don't forget about you when the time comes to apply for the grant. And secondly, it's important to be able to demonstrate to those people first what you're going to hopefully demonstrate in your grant proposal, and that is the importance of the initiative you want to carry out. So if it becomes an important and appealing initiative to your city government, that increases your chances of being able to apply successfully to a grant program and possibly obtain funding. It sounds almost terrible to say, but you want to be the squeaky wheel that wants to get some grease from these people, because if you're not engaged with them, they will forget about you because they're busy, they're doing their own things, and they have other stakeholders that they have to keep happy and engaged themselves. So as long as you can stay engaged and keep working with them, and also try to be as accommodating as possible for the things they're looking for, you'll have the ability to increase your chances of using them in the application process and successfully submitting something.
You've talked about public-funded grants. Is the process pretty much similar for private-funded grants?
It can be. Generally speaking, the same expectations will be there. You know, what is it that you plan to do? Why is it important? And how exactly do you plan to set out to fix that or remedy that or improve it? And then how do you plan to measure that so that we can know that we didn't just waste our money? But within the private funding system, it can differ a little bit. And in that context, I mean that there could be innovation challenges that will be grants through a private thing, but you have to come to the table with something brand new and unique and novel, whereas with some of the public funding sources, the government sources, you may be using something that's already established as a best practice. So innovation is an important key to that, but also there are a lot of similarities between the two groups, and the only major difference is going to be where you go find them. And they're actually sometimes very difficult to track down, but oftentimes you can find nonprofit agencies like the Robert Wood Johnson website provides some of that information. The Ford Foundation also provides grant funding for certain things. So oftentimes just a general website search or contacting us here at BlueStar through RACO or anything like that, we can go find those we can find those private sources for you and see if they're a viable option.
Touching on that a little bit, if somebody hears this webinar today and they think that, yes, I would like to do this, what information would they need in order to come to RACO and BlueStar in order to hopefully match themselves up with a grant that would help them fund their project?
Really just the basic information that would be necessary to get started in terms of what's the problem that you are looking to deal with, and if they already know, which it may not be necessary for them to know how actually to fix that problem. But if they're dealing with a specific issue, as long as we have that in hand, we can go look for the grant programs that would exist and work with RACO to try to set out a plan and figure out how we would put the initiative together and set out to apply for that funding. Most of the time, though, it comes down to the fact that we just need to find out what it is that you're dealing with within your own school or within your own library or within your own public agency in terms of law enforcement or fire or whatever it could be. And then from there we can find the best possible grant option for you.
All right. Well, Kevin, thank you very much. Lots of good information out there today. Thank you all for your participation in today's event. If you'd like more information on technology grants and see if this process is right for you, you can contact a RACO product specialist here at 1-800-446-1991. Again, thank you all for attending, and have a great day.